We're continuing our conversation about motivation, building on a previous lesson where we talked about some kinds of motivation that describe how students might be approaching the learning in a classroom. We talked about achievement goal theory, we talked about growth mindset theory, we talked about expectancy value theory. We talked a little bit about how important motivation is as a function, as a component of any high-functioning classroom. And now we're going to focus on something that is a key design element in gameful learning called self-determination theory. This is something that was developed first by two scholars at the University of Rochester, Ryan and Deasy, and it's become something of a cottage industry among motivation researchers, really being studied quite broadly for how it's related to students' intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So Rachel, we talk a lot about self-determination theory, especially when we're talking about gameful design.
Right.
How have you observed self-determination theory really playing a role in gameful design?
Right. So self-determination theory consists of three major components: that the learner's sense of autonomy, a learner's sense of belongingness, and a learner's sense of competence. And so when I'm working with an instructor to design a gameful learning environment, we really want to think about how do we maximize a learner's sense of agency over how they approach their learning. And we don't create learning environments where only some students learn certain aspects of the content. The goal is that everybody learns the content, but they have choice in how they demonstrate their learning, how they approach the learning, whether they're being exposed to content through reading or through video. And we think about multiple pathways to success. So the autonomy component, and I'll talk more about this in a later session where we really dig into the design of gameful learning elements and curricula, but the autonomy component is putting some of the sense of agency and choice on the learner as opposed to having a learning environment designed with the instructor as the sole determiner of how learning occurs and is demonstrated.
I think most school really is completely devoid of autonomy.
It really is.
Right? You show up, you do the things that the teacher wants you to do.
At the time that they want you to do them.
Pretty much in unison, too, in most classroom designs.
Right.
Which is strange because when you think about it, any group of students are going to be along a continuum of ability to accomplish the goals in front of them, how fast they work, how they want to work, what their inclinations are toward learning.
Right.
And so treating them like a group, you're already struggling, I think. That already creates a learning challenge.
Right. And this is one of the ways in which we think of gameful learning as personalized learning, right? That we really want the students to do the customization of how they approach their learning because they are at all points on a spectrum. And so Todd Rose, a Harvard researcher, talks about the end of average, that you can teach to the average, but there isn't actually a single student who embodies that average point. And so we really want to take gameful learning and allow the diversity of learners to thrive.
And I love the example that Todd Rose opens his research with, right? Which is that the military measured all the pilots they could to figure out what the average pilot dimensions were and designed a cockpit around that. And there were a huge number of plane crashes. And they realized that there actually was no average pilot.
Not a single one. So
what they introduced into cockpits were adjustable controls.
Right.
You could move the seat. You could adjust the distance of the yoke. That's what school needs.
Right. That's exactly what school needs, is to allow the learners, the students, to make the adjustments they need to maximize their learning.
So that's autonomy.
Right.
Recognizing that one size does not fit all. Right. You don't need to personalize for each individual, do you?
No. So you can create a menu of options and the learners will choose what suits them best. We talked a little bit about mastery-driven and oriented students, and those students might choose a particular pathway and seek out a different kind of challenge. Other learners with different orientations may take a pathway where they're more comfortable and they feel those supports, that scaffolding that you talked about in the previous lesson.
And I might point people back to the example I gave when I was describing the 10 core principles of gameful learning, where autonomy should be curated.
Right.
So part of the instructional role or the design role in a school is to curate what those choices are. It's not a free-for-all.
No, it's not a free-for-all. And you want to create those choices in a way that's developmentally appropriate for the learners that you're working with. So as students get older, they can handle more choice. And you can even think in the in Bloom's taxonomy, as students gain more knowledge, allowing them to create some assignments or design some assignments that they think will provide them and or their peers a chance to demonstrate unique learning.
So the second element you mentioned was belongingness or relatedness. How does that work?
So humans thrive in a social context. Even students who are more introverted, feeling like they're a part of a community, can really create that sense of support that they need to thrive and to feel motivated. So sometimes that's set up as accountability to their peers. Sometimes it's creating collaborative work environments where you encourage students to ask each other questions instead of relying just on asking the instructor or seeking out the information on their own. And so having students feel like they're part of a community, a social sphere with similar goals, can really nurture intrinsic motivation. And it's something that we see in video games, that those games that have a social component really bring learners in. So my own passion for some particular video games are because I'm interacting with people across the globe.
And we often hear students, especially in large high schools or in big colleges, they talk about feeling like a number.
Right.
So that's the opposite of relatedness.
Right.
You feel like nobody sees you.
Right.
So these are gameful learning in part are designs that help make it clear that what the student is doing is seen and is cared about.
Right. And that sense of belongingness can be with peers, but as you point out, that it's also that they're cared about by the administration or by the instructor, and they feel a relationship to that person, that there's an actual human connection. They're not just a number in the sea of students.
I mean, and one thing that I've done as an instructor when I'm teaching is I use a tool like Gradecraft to help me visualize where different students are on different pathways.
Right.
And that helps me. It's impossible for me to be in constant touch with all of my students. This is a class with about 80 students in it, a moderately sized class. But I can use data and analytics to help me identify who needs help now.
Right.
And that's a way for me to reach out to students and help them feel, again, seen.
Right. Right. And feel that sense of connection.
Now, that third component.
Competence. So we talked a little bit about this in the last lesson too, that students need to feel a challenge. When something is too easy, it doesn't actually feel like they're particularly competent because it's an easy task.
So it's like we're not respecting their intelligence.
Exactly. So we really want to give learners a challenge, but a challenge that's achievable, a stretch goal, but giving them the supports that they need. And so one way we've seen that play out, in no pun intended, in gameful learning is to have students all earning points from zero. So in traditional classrooms, often students start with 100%, and then their only outcome is to lose points from that because it's impossible to do everything perfectly. And in fact, if you're doing everything perfectly, you're not learning.
Yeah, that class is too easy for you.
Right.
And I literally have had when I was a student, instructors say to me, on the opening day of class, say to the whole room, hey, congratulations. As of today, you all have 100%. Perfect. But it's yours to lose. And of course you will. It's a losing game.
Right. And talk about setting learners up for a performance avoidance orientation because they just, the only thing they can do is lose.
Yes.
So thinking about setting students up for a sense of competence is everything that they do, they earn some points, not all the points. This isn't about getting a gold star for putting in a minimal amount of effort, but giving them realistic and authentic feedback about their performance, but allowing them to see how every effort, even if it's a failure in however they're going to define a failure, gets them closer to their goal. We've heard stories, our vice provost talks about watching his son play video games and hearing the noise of a character dying in a game. And our vice provost, James Hilton, says to his son, oh, bummer. And his son looks at him, the only way you can learn is through failure. And it was a moment of epiphany for Professor Hilton because he realized this is not how we've set up our education system. Students don't believe that failure is going to lead to learning when they're at school, but they know that it does when they're playing a video game.
There's an anecdote that I like about Thomas Edison, who famously tested thousands of kinds of filaments before he found the one that worked for the light bulb.
Right.
And a reporter supposedly asked him, how did it feel to fail 2,000 times? And he said, no, it was a 2,000-step process. And that's, if you talk to entrepreneurs, they understand that failure is a part of success.
Right.
And that if you don't fail, you're probably not trying to do hard enough things, and failure is an important way to learn.
Right.
And it's important to frame this, and we try to be very careful about this in gameful learning. We're not trying to create failure.
Right.
We're trying to get learners to recognize that failure is an important part of the learning process,
right,
and that it's an indication that you're trying hard things that are worth doing.
Right. And we give them the opportunity to recover from that failure.
Right.
So that's part of the sense of competence, is giving students choice in how they demonstrate their learning, because that gives them a chance to recover from failures.
That's choice. So competence and autonomy are really tightly linked.
They are really tightly linked. And so thinking about how we structure both the assignments but that feedback process, and making sure that the feedback is all those things we know about good feedback, that it's specific, it's actionable. And in gameful learning environments, students, when they're given an opportunity to recover from that failure, respond to that feedback. And so we've recognized that in gameful learning environments, feedback is as important, if not more important, than it is in a traditional classroom, because the students actually pay a lot of attention to it.
And that feedback needs to be frequent.
Yes.
It needs to be timely.
Yes.
I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a student in the college context post something on social media near a final saying, I wish I knew what I got on my midterm so I knew how hard to study for the final. Right. Well, I hope they study very hard all the time. That's another issue. But imagine if you were playing a game. Imagine if you were playing a sport, right, and you took a shot at a basket and didn't know if you made it or not until at the end of the game.
Right.
That would be a very strange context for
right,
adjusting and figuring out what your strategy ought to be moving forward.
Right. And so thinking about all of those elements of feedback, it doesn't have to be particularly formal feedback too, right? It can be those short, quick interactions you have with students in the classroom. Wow, you tried really hard on that. It looks like this strategy didn't work. What are you going to try next? And we've seen that both in the college context and in K-12, how those quick snippets of feedback can be as impactful as longer marginal comments on a paper.
So I want to bring this consideration of self-determination theory back around to intrinsic versus extrinsic.
Right.
Because it turns out that when the three elements that you named, autonomy, belonging, and competence, are present in a positive way in a learning environment, well, that is very supportive of students developing intrinsic motivation.
Right.
And when they're present in a negative way or absent, that means that we now need more extrinsic motivation to get students to engage.
Right.
So for me, when we think about gameful learning, if there's nothing else that you take away from this course, I would take away this idea that you want to promote autonomy, belonging, and competence in your learning environments. And that by itself will make a huge difference.
It will. So one question that I often hear from teachers and instructors is, where does competition fit in all of this? Does that defeat a sense of belonging? And given that we're talking about games, which often have a competitive element, what have you seen about competition being successful or counterproductive in instruction?
So it's a bit of a design challenge, right?
Right.
I think competition is actually extremely valuable because feeling, again, like you're part of a team is important. What you don't want to feel like is that you're an isolated person competing with everybody around you.
Right.
So that would be a negative kind of competition, but one that is surprisingly common in schools.
Right.
So imagine a classroom that uses a curve for a grading scale. Well, a curve is a kind of a leaderboard where you are always fighting against everyone around you for the spot you're in. It also rations success.
Right.
So that we're saying it doesn't matter how you do in this class. You have to be better than other people to achieve a high grade.
Right.
And that's a very negative element. I think we do much better when we think about a way to approach learning designs where everybody could conceivably succeed at a high level, and even a design where people are trying to help each other get there. I actually employ competition in my undergraduate classes, but through team-based competition.
Okay.
Where teams are supportive groups of learners, but they're competing sometimes against other groups of learners in the class in order to master the ideas of the course.
Right.
So I try to design activities where students are, through the activity, exploring the ideas of the class. It may be a design challenge, or it's hardly ever a straight sort of test or something like that.
Right. Because on a test, everyone could, in fact, if they work hard enough, get all the answers right.
Right.
Then why would you choose to give only some of those students that top mark, whatever it might be.
There's one more thing I think it's worth saying about self-determination theory before we close, which is that when you think about autonomy and belonging and competence, it's what students seek out naturally in their out-of-school activities.
Right.
And I have colleagues who very wisely, I think, cast the difference between informal or out-of-school learning and formal learning in school as a kind of struggle between autonomy and structure.
Right.
So a real design challenge for school organizations is to think about how they can continue to promote autonomy in a formal learning setting in a way that will promote this growth of intrinsic motivation and engagement.
Right.
In a future lesson, we're going to explore a little more about a particular aspect of motivation that you may be familiar with called grit. And Angela Duckworth from the Character Lab in the University of Pennsylvania is going to join us to help us understand the concept of grit and how it fits into these other ideas about motivation and engagement.